Alright, so in the first video I mentioned how to combine the images and line them up, and so I've already done that with these photos, and I used the tires to line the front two images up, and I used this door handle to line the middle image up. And now I haven't blended them yet, but now we have this back view, which I've taken from the opposite side of the vehicle, and I'm going to use that to build the part that was hidden behind that light post. So, to do this, I am going to line them up with the wheel again, since that's usually the easiest for me to line up with. And so you just make sure that it's lined up as best you can get it. And I'm going to use free transform, and it's obviously larger than it needs to be, so place that transform gizmo in the center of the wheel and use Alt and Shift to scale down. And my goal is to get the doors to line up the same, and it's rotated quite a bit from what it needs to be. And once you rotate the image, you're going to want this to line up with the brakes. The brake lights need to line up with each other, or at least the bottom there, and right about there seems to be correct, but this part's all messed up. So now that we know that is correct, we can move our gizmo over here to do further edits, because we know, well, I'm going to nudge that until that body seam on the bumper lines up, because that to me is more important. Now that that lines up, I'm going to move that gizmo right at that joint, which I know lines up, and rotate around that and use that as our next alignment method, and use a little bit of scale correction until that door looks like it's lining up at the right height. And let's zoom out to see what that looks like. And that looks to be about correct. I'm going to hide that, or show that fully, and switch between the two. For all intents and purposes, I would say that that back bumper looks like it's smoothly continued. Now for the layer mask, I'm going to invert that, and again, I only want to show the bare minimum simply because of the nature of that edit. And I'm going to fade into that rear bumper here and just use really light strokes on that brush to kind of ease in the details. I'm going to keep the gas cap on there because I like knowing where the gas cap's located when I'm modeling 3D cars. And there's an alignment issue here. I'm going to come in and say that muffler needs to stay, but the rest of it needs to go. So, and that seems to line up pretty nicely there. And just kind of fill in the details as necessary like that. And now that is our bumper. And just keep going until our whole entire bumper is filled in. And of course, the pinstriping doesn't look like it was installed correctly, or they might have had accident damage and had to have it repainted. So I'm going to hide that because I'm going to use that as the original side as our reference. Now, as you can tell, it looks weird because the lighting conditions were different. So I'm going to come in and put a adjustment layer for curves, and I'm going to cancel out of that. The layer is still there. I'm going to group it with the bottom layer so it only adjusts that one. So now you can edit that layer and nothing else. And of course, if you do that in OK, you can always just double click and it goes back and you can edit it. That's why I'm using an adjustment layer rather than using the filter itself. So we have a bit too much blue, so I'm going to tone that down in the curves, and we tone down the greens just a little tiny bit and bump up the entire brightness just a bit. And you keep going through these edits until you're satisfied that your lighting is pretty close to matching up. And now granted, just because of the lighting conditions, it might not be too close, but it'll at least be an improvement from what it was. And if you're really into detail, you can go in and use the smudge tool as your fingerprint. I can't, that's not in the video, so it's this icon right here. That's the tool I'm using. So if you're really into details, you can take that and make a new layer, make sure it's on use all layers, and then you can kind of smudge up those areas just ever so slightly, trying not to disturb your detail that's already in them. And that just smooths out those areas so that any lighting is kind of blended with itself. And another thing I can suggest is the rubber stamp tool at a low opacity, and then that sort of aids in your detail a little bit. You just kind of blend them in, make sure there's nothing peculiar looking on there. And if you shift R, you can go into what looks like a little drop icon. R is the smudge tool. You get a hand or a drop or a pyramid or a cone, I guess that looks like. You want the drop for the blur tool. You get that really big, and then you can just blur in these areas. The smudge tool works like basically finger painting. It distorts. But the blur tool, if you were to do that in the same spot, no, that was the smudge tool again. Cancel. The blur tool basically isn't set to use all layers. That's what the blur tool does. And that's a pretty nice tool just for coming in and smoothing out these areas that don't match up in color. And of course the rubber stamp tool is always your friend. As is the brush. Don't be afraid to just brush in that color there. Of course 100% is not a good value to brush with. I didn't notice that. And so that's how you add that final detail into there. And of course, making a guide and putting that on the ground plane there to line our final image up.